Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name's Henry Ziemer, and I'm an Associate Fellow with the Americas Program here at CSIS. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for a conversation on the future of U.S.-Canada minerals cooperation. Before we formally begin, let's take care of some logistics. This event will last approximately 60 minutes. We'll begin with a conversation with Christopher Hernandez Roy, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Americas Program at CSIS, about a report released in February of this year, Mining for Defense, Unlocking the Potential for Increased U.S.-Canada Critical Minerals Cooperation. Then, we'll delve into a panel featuring two expert panelists, Heather Exner-Pirot and Abigail Hunter. So Chris, I want to begin by taking a step back. As we're meeting today, Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump have just finished sitting down in the Oval Office to discuss the future of U.S.-Canada cooperation on the whole, where critical minerals was on sort of everyone's minds. Can you explain what the purpose of the report was and how it's relevant today in this context?
Yes, thank you very much, Henry. First thing to mention in the press briefing with the Prime Minister and President Trump, critical minerals came up in terms of the steel and aluminum tariffs broadly that the President has imposed worldwide. The issue of critical minerals in that public discussion was not raised, but the President and the Prime Minister are, as we speak, having a working lunch, and I'm sure the issue of critical minerals and U.S.-Canada cooperation on that and in their relationship to defense is probably something that they're going to discuss. So I think what the report highlights is that U.S.-Canada cooperation on critical minerals is absolutely key, especially at this time of heightened geopolitical tensions in a much more dangerous world. Now, there's precedent for this. The U.S. and Canada were very close allies during World War I, and in fact, in his book, in Tim Cook's book, The Good Allies, he says that probably Canada's greatest contribution during World War II was its ability to complement U.S. industrial output in large part by the provision of critical minerals. Canada was producing a lot of aluminum that went into Allied aircraft during the war, nickel for armaments, and in fact uranium that was used in the Manhattan Project. And so now, in this time and place of 2025, in a world that is again seeing sort of a confrontation between democracies on the one hand and authoritarian governments on the other, much like during the period leading up to World War II and obviously during World War II, this has become an issue again. Why? Because the war in Ukraine has revealed the fragility of the U.S. Industrial base. It's revealed the lack of capacity to rapidly replace munitions. And this is at a time also when China is rapidly expanding its military power. And this all translates into a need to strengthen the U.S. industrial defense base, not just the U.S. base, the Canadian base, the Europeans, for instance, who have also just released a plan to spend 800 billion euros to rearm the continent. So this is where critical minerals, and particularly in the defense realm, becomes absolutely essential in the bilateral relationship between Canada and the United States. In addition to all that, China, which basically for a number of minerals has a monopoly or a very large share of the market, not necessarily because it produces or it mines them itself, but because it controls a lot of the refining capacity, in its trade war with the United States has placed export bans, export restrictions, and it's been guilty of price manipulation over a long time. So that is another incentive for deeper cooperation between Canada and the United States, where Canada can hopefully be increasingly a substitute for stuff that's coming from China.
Right, we see over there, Canada remains the United States' #1 source of mineral imports on the whole, but look, China is creeping up. Of course, this is in 2023, predating a lot of the trade tensions and conflicts that we're seeing today.
And one thing we don't really mention in the report, but it's notable on this graphic, is the importance of Mexico as well. And again, as you say, this is for all minerals and metals, so not just the ones that are critical for defense, but it shows you how important Canada is vis-a-vis China, and also highlights the importance of Mexico as well.
Yeah. So we've been talking about defense and the importance of minerals for the defense industrial base. I think that's broadly intuitive, but what are sort of defense critical minerals, Chris, and how did you, in the report, arrive at the key defense critical minerals?
So, there are 50 critical minerals on the U.S. Geological Survey's list. There's 45 critical minerals on the Defense Logistics Agency critical mineral list, and we couldn't look at everything. So we had to narrow it down, and we did that by comparing what was on those two lists and also seeing which minerals were more likely to be subject to supply chain vulnerability by China restricting or banning its export, which minerals were most sensitive for the defense industry, and where Canada could be a good substitute. And here we have the list of the 10 that we kind of shortlisted. And the very short list, of course, is the 5 that we actually focused on: gallium, niobium, the group of rare earth elements, cobalt and tungsten. And these were the minerals that we focused on in our report. You'll notice here in the relevance, reliance, I should say, on a foreign adversary, i.e. the ability of an adversary to disrupt, we have 2 of the minerals that we only say are somewhat subject to potential disruption. That's because there are other sources of niobium, in particular Brazil, but in Brazil, one of the largest mines is actually controlled by a Chinese company, and the same is true of cobalt, where the largest production really is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Right. But again, a lot of that supply is going to China. So these were the 5 minerals that we focused on in the report, and it's important to remember that. I think we can go to the next maybe slide. It's important to remember that these metals, within the Canadian context, that Canada is actually part of the U.S. defense industrial base. Right. And what are these things really used for, right? Gallium, it's really important for chips, for semiconductors, and they're used in a range of things, but importantly in radars and electronic warfare systems. Niobium is something that's added to steel. It makes a super light, super strong alloy, which is used in fighter jets and also in hypersonic weapons. There's actually a CSIS paper that you co-authored about niobium and its use in hypersonic weapons. Rare earth elements, there's a whole group of them. Probably the most important application is for magnets, which have both civilian, as in clean energy, but also military applications, and they're used in a range of things, including laser targeting systems, radar and sonar systems. Cobalt, also part of the clean energy uses with its application in high-capacity batteries, but it also has important military applications in, for instance, jet engines. And finally, tungsten, which is a very dense and very difficult material to penetrate, is naturally used for a range of munitions and also other applications. And I should say about these that gallium, 98% of the production of gallium is in China, and there's currently an export ban on that critical mineral. Niobium, as I mentioned, 82% of the supply comes from Brazil, but China owns the largest mines. With rare earths, we're talking about China controlling 85% of world processing, and 80% of cobalt refining is also coming from China. And finally, the tungsten, the last metal, China produces 85% of world supply. So these were really the key things that we wanted to focus on.
I think it's telling that as we look at this list, right, China has export controlled 3 of the 5 minerals currently, if I've got that right.
That's right.
Niobium and cobalt being the only 2 that we're still seeing some flexibility on it, maybe, although those 2 could be subject to some of these trade manipulations. So I want to get into now, thank you for that excellent overview of their importance in the defense industry, but what's Canada's role, and how can Canada, how realistic is it for Canada to become a competitor to China in a lot of these minerals, and what does sort of the broader mining landscape look like in Canada today?
So here we should have very shortly a map, yes, map of Canada, and these were the cobalt, gallium, niobium, rare earth, and tungsten deposits or mines that we mentioned in our report. You can see they're kind of all over the country. What's important is to think of a whole supply chain approach, and that's needed for critical mineral security. Mining is important, but refining is absolutely key, refining and processing, and also recycling. These are absolutely essential, and Canada can play a role in each one of those different stages. Now, defense metals, particularly these niche defense metals, they do not drive the market. And Canada is not necessarily price competitive with China on all of these things, especially because China manipulates the markets. And when somebody tries to get into production of a new mine and there's a certain economic viability about it, China learns about this and can manipulate it so that their economic forecasts crash. But the point is, the U.S. and other defense partners of Canada need these critical minerals and for reliable, they need a reliable supply of these minerals for their defense industries. And when the U.S. and others are looking for this as a substitute for China, Canada should be front of mind. I'd like you to show me a broader map here. This is a map taken from Natural Resource Canada, and it shows sort of the broader mining landscape in Canada, where there are existing mines and projects and some refineries. I show this just to give you a bit of a visual scale. Some of the areas are just so concentrated you can't even see the individual mines, and there's probably a lot more up in this area in Canada's Arctic, which is a very difficult environment to look for and to develop. But there's already tremendous amount of mining in Canada, and there's a lot more potential. I want to just mention tariffs very quickly, which is not something that we discussed in our report, in part because it was published just days before the initial 25% tariffs announced by President Trump. And I think it's relevant as Prime Minister Carney and President Trump are sitting down over lunch. Mining on tariffs, mining companies are price takers. They cannot absorb the cost of a tariff. And tariffs, as we've seen, not just in the mining sector, but broadly across the economy, especially tariffs that are imposed one day, modified the next day, et cetera, create a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And the mining sector requires capital to develop, first of all, develop the projects, the initial exploration, et cetera, but then more importantly, to actually get the mine into production. It requires a lot of money. It requires patient capital that needs to be willing to wait a long time before it sees a return on investment. Uncertainty drives that away. So this has a double effect. The tariffs have a double effect on the mining sector. And as it's possibly not a great idea to be tariffing the minerals and your allies right at a time when China is restricting and outright banning the export of certain really essential minerals. So I think critical minerals is going to be part of the discussion that the President and the Prime Minister are having, and I think it's a piece in the puzzle to finding that new relationship, that new commercial and defense relationship between the United States and Canada.
Absolutely. And in the spirit of getting a little bit closer to that, the report includes several policy recommendations at the end. Can you walk us through some of the key policy recommendations that it spells out?
Yeah, no, for sure, Henry. Thank you. And so I just hit on the biggest ones. I think we have 6 in there, but a couple I think might be relatively novel. Others I think are well known within the mining industry itself, if not as well known within government. But the first thing we suggest is that Canada should think about establishing an equivalent to the United States' Defense Department's Defense Production Act Title III, where there is money that is provided in grants for for exploration and for the initial phases of getting a mine, the feasibility studies and all that for getting a mine on the ground. And so Canada does have monies to support mining through Natural Resources Canada, but this would be a different thing. It would be specifically for the defense sector. And this potentially could have the added benefit of those funds, since they would be administered by Canada's Department of National Defense, they could count potentially towards Canada's 2% NATO target for defense spending. So it would have maybe a double benefit there. We suggested that since the United States, Canada, Mexico trade agreement, the USMCA, or CUSMA as it's known in Canada, or TMEC as it's known in Mexico, since that is going to be renegotiated and not just a review, that maybe consideration could be given to having a chapter on critical minerals. Yeah. Obviously, the main benefit of that would be to exclude minerals from any possible tariffs, but it could include other things such as ensuring a supply between the countries in the event of some sort of an emergency or crisis, and it could have other sort of provisions such as, while there are already NAFTA or USMCA visas for specialized people, there could be maybe some enhanced category for engineers and people in the mining industry with very specific skill sets that could more easily work across the borders in North America. So that's another thing that we suggested that could enhance the trilateral and of course the bilateral relationship. We mentioned that Canada should consider having a national stockpile of critical minerals. The US has one, Canada does not. This would be a way of insulating against price shocks from China for Canada and for Canadian industries that rely on critical minerals. And interestingly, in the last 2 weeks, I believe it is, the Australian government has announced a similar effort to protect their country against supply shocks in the critical minerals space. And I'll mention just one last thing, which is, I referred to this area here, Canada's Arctic. It is an area of increasing geopolitical interest, especially as the Arctic gets warmer from climate change, especially as Canada has these navigable waterways, at least by the summers in the next 10 or 20 years, which are the closest shipping routes between Europe and Asia. Developing critical minerals in the Arctic is hampered by a lack of infrastructure in this area. And there could be a triple win here in the sense that mining companies could invest in infrastructure supported by the government, which would benefit the communities that live in these areas that are the anchors for Canadian sovereignty in the region, and could serve a third use, which might be used by the armed forces in the event of an emergency or some sort of natural disaster or something. So those were, I think, the three highlights. There are others, and I urge our audience to read the report.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Chris. And a reminder to you, our audience, to please check out the report, Mining for Defense, Unlocking the Potential for Increased U.S.-Canada Critical Minerals Collaboration on CSIS.org.
So Henry, there's clearly a lot more to unpack, and it hasn't been mentioned here, but of course you are the co-author of the report. And I'd like to bring in the two real experts to our discussion, our two panelists. Our first one is Heather Exner-Pirot. She's a senior fellow and director of natural resources, energy, and environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa. Heather has 20 years of experience researching and writing on Indigenous economic development, resource politics and policy, energy security, Arctic human security, regional Arctic governance, and the Arctic Council, among other topics. It's quite a broad range of expertise. She's a member of the Canadian Defence and Security Network and a network coordinator at the North American and Arctic Defence and Security Network. Heather has a PhD in political science from the University of Calgary. Our next panelist is Abigail Hunter. She is the executive director of the Center for Critical Mineral Strategy at SAFE. Heather previously served as director of international affairs and partnerships within the Minerals Center. In this role, she nurtured existing and new safe partnerships to advance sustainable and ethical supply chains among allies and like-minded countries. Before joining SAFE, Abigail also headed federal government affairs for the province of Quebec for nearly 3 years as the senior attaché in Washington, D.C. Her mandate focused on energy, environment, and trade relationships between the province and the United States. And we're going to bring Henry in, again, as the co-author, to be our third panelist. And Henry is the Associate Fellow of the Americas Program here at CSIS. And his research interests include defense topics in the Americas, transnational organized crime, human rights, and security in Central America, as well as geopolitical competition with China and Russia in the region. Welcome to you all. Thank you very much for being here. So I want to get right into a discussion and start asking the three of you some questions. Heather, Canada has just emerged from these elections, historic elections that were celebrated or held on April 28th. And perhaps the single dominant issue for many Canadians was the relationship with the United States. And as we mentioned at the top, the Prime Minister and the President have just sat down to discuss that relationship. Given the Prime Minister's observation that the relationship with the United States needs to be reshaped, what are the prospects for U.S.-Canada cooperation on minerals in the short and medium term?
Yeah, great question, and thanks so much for having me. And it was a fantastic paper, and I commend everyone listening here to have a read. So obviously in Canada, we've been very focused on what's happening south of the border and the tariff threats, and it's upending a bit of our economy as well as the global economy. And as you rightly pointed out, that is not an environment that is conducive to attracting long-term investment and patient capital. And so it certainly has had a disruptive effect. But all that being said, it looks like most tariffs don't apply to Canadian companies, although some obviously are still in the web. And a lot of the, you pointed out that huge amount of trade that we do have between Canada and the United States and minerals, and it goes both ways. But those are usually long-term offtake agreements. And it's pretty clear in most contracts that, that the American company would pay for tariffs as it's a kind of a domestic tax from a contract perspective. And so none of those were disrupted, those long-term agreements that are still going and people are still mining. So what existed before largely still existed now. And I have to say one, positive thing that came out this week was another U.S. DPA or Defense Production Act award to another Canadian mine. And so we had seen quite a flurry of activity in the past year. Under the last year, the Biden administration, I think there were 6 awards of U.S. DPA funding to Canadian projects, usually matched again, as you mentioned, with Natural Resources Canada. But we had seen the first last week since the Trump administration came on board to the CSIS tungsten moly mine that you actually included in your report in New Brunswick. And so that is a very good sign that behind the scenes, there's still cooperation, there's still a recognition and a desire to work towards the medium and long term. And so hopefully that's a sign of good things to come.
Thanks, Heather. And we should remember that the critical minerals sort of plan between Canada and the United States was actually signed during the first Trump administration. So there's an early precedent for cooperation on critical minerals. Abigail, I kind of sort of ask you the same question. How do you see this elevated focus on critical minerals playing out in the U.S.-Canada relationship? Is there space for deal making here?
In short, yes. Oh, and first, thank you guys for having me and congratulations on a great report. But yes, I do think this administration has shown consistent willingness to strike deals, and minerals have obviously emerged as a key pillar of President Trump's foreign policy. The tense rhetoric between Canada and the United States has somewhat subsided, with the Liberation Day tariffs putting other allies in a similar camp as Canadian exporters, and then obviously with today's meeting of the leaders at the White House. Plus, it's been clear that Prime Minister Carney sees Canada's minerals as a strength and advantage in engaging internationally with the United States. However, if there is somewhat of a U.S.-Canada deal struck, I think it would be more complicated and certainly different than the deals we've seen to date with Ukraine and the DRC for a few reasons. As compared to the Ukraine deal, there's already deep integration of mineral supply chains between the US and Canada, as you've rightly pointed out at the beginning of this session and in the report. Half of Canada's copper comes south to the United States in different forms. Canada is tied with China as the largest supplier of minerals to the United States, with both in first place with 21 minerals. And then secondly, the motive is very different. Ukraine and DRC are looking for security guarantees in exchange for mineral rights. The mineral rights are a means for the US to compete with $60 billion that the CCP has put into foreign mines and processing in the last 2 decades. And with Canada, it's far more of an economic than a security exposure. That economic exposure and leverage isn't siloed to a specific sector of minerals, it is economy-wide. So there's definitely more chips on the negotiation table. And then third, and most importantly, we already have a deal in place to update. USMCA, or CUSMA as it's known in Canada. Part of USMCA is that in 6 years, it's up for review. We are nearing that point, and well before Donald Trump's second election and mandate, former Trump officials had said to me, you know, Abigail, I think we were missing a minerals chapter, particularly around the rules of our origin, automotive parts that were more focused on internal combustion engines, but also just not reflecting the cross-border relationship regarding minerals, and certainly there's an opportunity there.
Thanks, Abigail. Well, on the issue of a chapter, as you know, because you were the co-author, one of the recommendations, and I mentioned earlier, was the idea of exploring a new USMCA chapter on critical minerals. Why would that be important, and what would that potentially include, Henry?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think that everyone here on this panel has at varying points advocated for and articulated very expertly the importance of a critical minerals chapter in USMCA, and the number of things that could unlock, from labor mobility to more patient capital to increased standards on rules of origin is truly dramatic. But I'm going to focus on sort of what I would say are 2 key points with this. The first being certainty and the desire to establish some kind of common rules of the road. I think a lot of people went into the second Trump administration thinking, Abigail mentioned maybe erroneously so, that because USMCA was a Trump deal, it was kind of locked in place, it wasn't going to get touched that much. What we've seen from the first 100 days is that is certainly not true, that it is up for grabs. And if it's up for grabs, the pressure and the incentives to strike another deal when it comes around for renegotiation, strike a deal early. We note in the report that USMCA review is scheduled, yes, for July 2026. We may see some action on this sooner as both Mexico and Canada look to try and get more certainty in the relationship as soon as possible to preserve their exports and access to U.S. markets. The second aspect I'm going to say is the potential for USMCA to go beyond just being a purely economic trade deal. This idea we've seen in the Carney-Trump meeting that Carney went down planning to strike a new economic and security relationship, sort of coupling those 2 desires. And I think that what we're going to see in a future USMCA, maybe USMCA 2.0 or 1.5, if you will, is a greater focus on that security dimension. I think we're going to see much more pressure on Mexico, for instance, to limit Chinese, its potential to be a backdoor for China. We're going to see more pressure on various hard security, economic security aspects, and that's where critical minerals can play a really important role. Because as we've been discussing, the elephant in the room is the fact that the United States and Canada and Mexico, for that matter, are dependent on adversaries, on geopolitical bad actors, China, Russia, for key inputs. And we have so much abundance here in our hemisphere and in our North American community that we should be viewing those critical minerals not as just a tool for economic development and economic growth, but as a tool for geopolitical leverage and security. So that's where I think there's actually some potential here that if all 3 countries approach with similar mindsets or with a more cooperative orientation, that a critical minerals chapter could be in the best interest of all 3.
kind of like one of the critical ingredients for Fortress North America.
Absolutely. That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah. Heather, market risks, long permitting times, outdated laws on mining mean new projects face significant hurdles. This is no news to anybody in the room or online. Are there best practices that Canada can glean from other jurisdictions to scale up production while mitigating environmental externalities? And what are the principal obstacles in Canada to moving more quickly to developing critical minerals, which was in fact an important part of the platform of both the Conservatives and the Liberals in the recent election?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you pointed out, we've been talking about critical minerals for well over 5 years, and there's been renewed policy focus on that. But we still haven't, kind of gone over the goal line of really increasing production. And why is that? I have to say that the number one challenge is market prices. That, for your list, and particularly for a niche or a byproduct or lightly traded metals, the market is still pretty bad in a lot of cases, where China is able to manipulate the market. Canada has been able to attract significant funding in uranium and potash and gold. We're having, new investments, $1 billion investments, record production, a lot of those. And so it does tell you that where there is a healthy market, we are able to produce. Now, that being said, there's a lot that we can do in Canada, and a lot gets talked about, and I talk about it a lot of what we can do to improve. I'd say number one is we have often overlapping or redundant processes between the federal government and the provinces. And so it's very much the desire of most of the provinces and most of the mining industry to take out the federal assessment overlay as much as possible. To have the federal government really just focus on things in their jurisdiction, like the marine life, fish, that kind of thing, and let the provinces really take the lead on regulating and permitting mines. Then we get into Indigenous issues, and as you know, Indigenous rights are very well held up in Canada. It's part of the Constitution. And we're very proud of that and want to see, benefits and the rights upheld, but it does complicate approvals and timelines, in that Indigenous groups must be consulted, they must be accommodated, and increasingly there is an expectation of consent or as close to consent as possible to get projects moved ahead. So the industry has done quite a bit of work, I would say, in the last 20 years of managing that, of creating new tools, ways to align with Indigenous communities. I do a lot of work, usually they're not opposed to a project. Usually they say they're opposed to being left out. And so whether that's impact and benefit agreements and, revenues, training, employment, that all helps. And increasingly looking at equity as a way to get Indigenous communities and industry aligned. Probably not in the mine itself. Mines are very volatile, risky bets. Communities don't usually have that risk tolerance. But certainly in the sustaining infrastructure, we're talking about rail or ports or electricity or heat generation, that might be a good candidate for equity. So we're working on it, but it's been too slow for industry's liking, for sure.
Heather, you mentioned energy, so I want to turn to Abigail. A key challenge across the mineral supply chain is energy. It's needed for mining and refining alike. How do you see both the United States and Canada working to scale up the energy infrastructure needed to unlock mineral production? What are some of the roadblocks in both countries?
The president said it best, in the meeting with Prime Minister Carney a few minutes ago, that both countries are blessed with high amounts of energy resources. But in order for us to best position industry in this period of reindustrialization and to ensure North American competitiveness, we need to connect that affordable, reliable, and, in most cases, ideally clean, given the customer demand for it, energy sources to production lines. Aluminum smelting cost is 40% electricity, giving its nickname congealed electricity. Metallization is incredibly energy intensive. That's why we have both planned metallization plants in the United States and Texas. And this is true for many more minerals. I can't speak as aptly as Heather for the specifics of what Canada needs to do to unlock energy resources for refining and mining, as I once did when working for the government of Quebec. But in the United States, the answer is very clear. We need permitting reform, congressionally authorized permitting reform to unlock sources of energy to fuel this industrial future. investors really are looking for permitting reform coming out of Capitol Hill to make sure that there is a stickiness to this policy. Nobody wants to be the Keystone XL of mining, right? We don't want to see movement of projects that have the ability to be unwound as elections can change the political landscape, right? So having bipartisan permitting reform passed is absolutely paramount. And then once we get that, our own unilateral reforms to unlock energy resources and connect them to the processing facilities, the refineries, the smelters, then we can start to think about cross-border electron flows that will unlock an even more competitive energy landscape. In Secretary Burgum's home state, you have a really good example to emanate with Manitoba Hydro flowing to North Dakota and Minnesota and acting as a base load for North American wind when there's an overproduction of wind in the middle of the night when they don't need that power. So that type of complementarity can unlock future competitiveness for minerals production. But again, we got to start with some reforms at home first on Capitol Hill.
Heather, do you want to take a stab at that? I mean, Canada is blessed with tremendous amounts of hydro electricity, renewable energy, and that's why you see, the large aluminum smelters are actually in the province of Quebec, which has the largest amount of renewable hydroelectricity. What does the Canadian energy landscape look like, and vis-a-vis its requirements for mining?
Yeah, well, I mean, the commodities that Canada has produced are almost always, world leading, top decile, top quartile of GHG intensity. And that's because where we do, mine and process, we usually use hydro. And so the inputs are very low carbon. And so that's certainly an ESG benefit from going from Canada. But we are, as everyone is, facing for the first time in a while, real growing energy demand, especially electricity demand, especially for data centers and for AI, and for reshoring some of our manufacturing capacity. So that is starting to bite into the available amount of hydro for big industrial projects. We're already seeing some constraints in BC, for example, as we develop an LNG sector. Liquefaction is very energy intense, and mine will compete certainly in BC and other places with some, reshoring of manufacturing with liquefaction for some of that energy. So while we would love to use the hydro, big new projects for hydro are very expensive. And have big environmental impact. And so we're drawing down on our existing capacity. And in my opinion, nuclear and natural gas is going to have to take up some of the slack. And we can offshore what are, considered heavy emitting sectors. I can't imagine getting a smelter approved and permitted and getting social license in Canada, but we're going to have to. So these things that are fairly heavy emitting on the processing side, we're going to be very clever, but Canada certainly has the energy to support this. We can either offshore it to China where they're going to use coal, or we can bring it home to Canada where it will be, by almost definition, a cleaner and certainly a safer product.
Thank you. Henry, China's dominance of critical minerals, in some cases mining, in most cases refining, is well known. Looking across the defense sector in particular, where do you see the greatest vulnerabilities? What materials are receiving less attention than they should?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I think that somewhat paradoxically, China is almost doing us a favor with its announcements of various export controls on all these critical minerals, on gallium, germanium, antimony, tungsten, and most recently 7 of the 17 rare earths, because they're signaling that they are willing to use critical minerals as a tool in this fight. And ideally, industry is taking these signals and adjusting accordingly, saying that, okay, maybe it's no longer, even if it is more price competitive, it's no longer safe to rely on China for all of these rare, all of these various critical mineral inputs. So in a sense, the fact that we're doing this before we reach a real boiling point crisis is a good thing, because there's time to react. Not that much time, maybe, but there's at least some time. And one thing that we do see is that also that sanctions across the board, from minerals to economic ones, tend to work less well the more you do them. The more minerals you sanction, the less attractive you make your overall mineral sector for future investment, for future off-taking, for future agreements. We've seen this in China's case in the past when it restricted rare earths to Japan over a fishing dispute. And Japan stood up a major fund to help diversify its rare earth suppliers and has been relatively successful at doing so. I do worry, however, because I don't necessarily see all of the same urgency or the same level of urgency from the U.S. broadly. I think the defense sector is making some very good strides, but I actually, it doesn't actually seem like we're operating under a mentality of, oh, a switch could go off tomorrow and we would lose all of, say 98% of the gallium that we import. And why do I think that? I think that's because currently the structure of China's minerals retaliation is mainly taking the form of export controls, where there's basically you have to register that you're exporting, and China can sort of thumbs up or thumbs down. And I think that overall there's been a presumption of approval. We write about this in another report for CSIS. There's been sort of a presumption of approval for a lot of these exports, meaning that you can still get access to them. It's not as if the pipe has totally closed off. So that means that there's maybe a false sense of security at play for some of these minerals that is contributing to us not making the investments with the urgency that we need. In other areas of the sort of the defense industrial supply chain that I'll comment on, and this is certainly maybe a little bit selfish, but I think niobium in particular does not receive the deserved attention. Niobium, when we put out our piece on Brazil's niobium sector, we're sort of shocked at the number of people coming to us who had never even heard of the mineral in the first place. And it's second only after gallium in the USGS's list of minerals most at risk with the highest disruption potential. Why is that? Well, or what's the role of niobium? As you point out in your opening remarks, it's incredibly lightweight, it has incredibly high thermal resistance, and in sort of the domestic economic side of things, small amounts of niobium can significantly strengthen the strength of steel. So it's vital for a domestic steel industry. It's also vital if you care about the future of hypersonic weapons, which need to travel at very high speeds, and in doing so, burn very hot and need to be lightweight enough to fly quickly. So I would definitely sort of put a pin in that. I would love to see more analysis being done on the niobium supply chain more broadly. This piece and another one tried to kind of throw some hand grenades into the mix, but would love to see more research done on that. So I would say that's my general overview from where we sit now.
And specifically when it comes to niobium, I'm surprised there's not more attention to it because, as you mentioned, it has commercial applications as well.
Yeah.
And given the president's interest in reshoring much of the automobile manufacturing sector, it's key in making car bodies stronger and lighter,
yeah,
making them more fuel efficient as well. Can I turn to both you, Heather and Abigail, just to comment on this issue of China and its export restrictions or its bans, its outright bans, and how that is impacting the Canada-U.S. relationship? Or should be impacting the Canada-U.S. relationship in the critical mineral space? Maybe start with you, Heather.
Well, first of all, I'll say I couldn't agree more. No, I lost my train of thought because Abigail was going to go first. I couldn't agree. Abigail, you go first. I lost my train of thought. I have to come back to what I was going to say.
Yes, happily. So yeah, I mean, lots and lots to unpack here. We have many documented export control actions that Henry really well delineated. Maybe I'll speak to the most recent one that's caused a flurry of attention, the April 2025 announcement on the 7 rare earth elements that you guys talked about. These are really, painful restrictions, I would say, because of the nature of rare earths being embedded in a far broader array of technology applications from defense, automotive, energy, manufacturing, electronics, and the medical space, but specifically the ubiquity of the heavy rare earth elements across critical technologies and the world's really overwhelming reliance on the PRC for their separation, plus the long lead times it requires to develop alternative sources really dramatically raises the stakes. I think to answer your question, it does necessitate looking at places like Canada, but also Brazil, which you guys have talked about from an niobium perspective too, Vietnam, maybe partners like Australia and Japan and Malaysia for heavy rare earth feedstock. The U.S. has made a pretty good dent in the production of light rare earth production and with Mountain Pass and some other projects, but more work is needed on the heavy fronts. I think also, you guys talked about at the beginning, Canada's contribution to the U.S. defense industrial base makes them a really great supplier for defense contractors who have been forced to look away from China due to NDAA provenance requirements for a couple of years now. But commercially, as Henry points out, we need to be a little bit less complacent around the supply threat because there's a tendency to, escalate and de-escalate. And I think the trend is what, industry should be looking at with great concern. The question is, are we going to have alternative sources of heavies or other alternative sources of supply online quickly to really make sure that inventories are replenished for ex-China magnet producers? More likely, I think concerted effort for medium-term relief is needed here. Partnership between the U.S., Canada, other nations, starting now, but then getting more alternative producers in production to support a burgeoning U.S. magnet industry is needed. And then the second question kind of goes to what Heather talked about before, which is kind of the market volatility and manipulation that we've witnessed. Big vertical integration with the Chinese firms, allowing them to integrate upstream and downstream activities. And then this advantage there is they can then shift value along the supply chain, especially in cases like rare earths where they dominate all nodes of the supply chain. So that really allows for the intentional flooding of global markets with low-cost critical minerals. But it also precipitates the question from U.S. manufacturers, global manufacturers, meet me at China prices, because you have these distorted low price below what's feasible to even operate within the PRC. And we've seen that really directed by the PRC Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. So I think the administration is looking with Canada, but with other allies, particularly mineral consuming countries, to make sure that there is insulation from these price shocks, from specifically the price manipulation shocks, through negotiating off reciprocal tariffs and 232 tariffs. I think it's really important to continue those conversations, but also to note that this type of government intervention is not a broad brush silver bullet. We're talking about a lot of really unique markets for each of these minerals, and so important to kind of think creatively about how we explore similar support mechanisms that don't break the bank, so to speak, in the price side. So Heather, hopefully that bought you enough time to think of something smart to say. I'll turn it back to you.
Well, Abigail, it's hard to top that because that was such a smart answer. But I did remember what I was going to say. I was just going to say I couldn't agree more with Henry. That China's done us a favor in a sense by putting these restrictions on, because it has sparked the market for some of these commodities to say, hey, we need more of this. Prices are good, and some Western suppliers are now stepping in. Antimony is a great example. I think a project in Montana now is ramping up. We do have brownfield in a lot of these things. We do have some, minor capacity that you can ramp up. And so those are the low-hanging fruit of things that can come on. And with prices, when China puts the export restriction on, the price goes up. Or when we put a tariff on China, the price goes up. And so in a sense that the market is working to do some of these things. I'm grateful that China's doing it now. I think the concern with China controlling these critical minerals is that you'd be on the verge of some kind of conflict with Taiwan when you had to ramp up your defense supply chain, and you wouldn't be able to. I think we're still hopefully a few years, hopefully never, but we're still some ways away, I think, from having that conflict with Taiwan. And so I do think, we bought ourselves a little bit of time where we really have to get serious, really have to find those alternative supplies. And now we're actually doing so.
Thanks, Heather. Hey, Henry, back to you for a second. Minerals investments can be a tool to help Canada improve its posture, its defense posture in particular, in the Arctic. And as I said earlier, because they can have a dual or triple use. How can Canada leverage mineral investments in the Arctic to shore up security and defense of that vital region?
Sure. Thank you, Chris. Exactly as you mentioned, we're sort of, the final recommendation of the paper focuses on this dual or maybe even triple use commercial development and military role that minerals investments in the Arctic can have. And I would say, there are basically two things that I look at when I see the advantages of mining investments for Canadian Arctic defense, and it's power, as we've talked about very, very adeptly. You install generation capacity, significant power capacity, and probably the amount of energy that you need to run your mine or your minerals project. The amount of energy that's needed to wire to a nearby town or to a nearby military facility when it's not full scale operation is relatively trivial. So getting that generation capacity online is super critical. The other thing is then transportation. Getting access to the Canadian Arctic is very difficult. It's not like the European Arctic, where basically there are major population centers already in the Arctic Circle, which makes it relatively easy to access if you need a military base. You already have airfields there, you already have road networks there. The Canadian Arctic is much harder to access even with sort of warming conditions. So if you build the transport infrastructure needed to get your minerals down to distribution centers, the airfields needed to fly in support for for medevac, that can also theoretically be used again in an emergency. And we actually see often today all infrastructure in the Arctic is in the Canadian Arctic is dual use in the sense that when there's an emergency, you need to be able to access the full scale of info. And I see Heather with a hand up, because I would love to turn it over to her for some additional comments.
I'd love her to mention maybe Canada's small modular nuclear reactors. Go ahead.
Yeah, because I think about this topic all the time.
Yeah.
There is limited infrastructure in the Canadian Arctic, so you're always looking at ways, to maximize what you have. And one great example is there was former Polaris mine in Nunavut that shut down in 2002. We said, what can we do with this? It seems like a waste, and they turned it to the Nanisivik refueling facility. But that's also a warning. It's also a warning story to say, it takes time and money and resources and people on the ground and fuel, to your point, to keep these bases in the Arctic going. And so if you don't already have a community beside a deposit, you don't have a mine, sometimes you have to say, is it worth the expense of keeping that dot, keeping it going in the Canadian Arctic, or should we just be putting more, resources to where there's already people, to where you could do some maintenance of aircraft or maintenance of radar? So it is a tricky question. One, as an example, Rio Tinto is shutting down one of its diamond mines in Northwest Territories, probably in early 2026 is scheduled now. And you say, well, we hate to lose this $2 billion investment. It has an airstrip, it has diesel generation, it has camp for hundreds of workers. Is there some way we can make this into a base? And it's not as straightforward as you would hope, because again, there's no one living there. You can't just have fuel tanks just sitting there. They need energy to stay warm so that the fuel, in minus 50 can still work. People to live there. So sometimes it's trickier than you would hope. But to your point on SMRs, where I really see really great potential is innovation in energy and communications and infrastructure that you could use for both defense purposes, mining purposes, and community purposes. And SMR seems to fit that bill. We have an SMR going to the U.S. Alaska Air Force Base, Eielson, probably in the next 2 or 3 years. And that will give lessons to say, well, how will this work for a community? How would this work for a mine? And really pave some doors and give us a real point of reference to say what works. So I'm quite optimistic in sharing technology, and sometimes having that military as the anchor tenant to buy new technology or to try it out makes it easier for everybody else afterwards.
Thanks, Heather. And I want to just maybe look at now for a second some of the other partners who are partners both of Canada and the United States, some of our collective other allies, the Europeans, and maybe even sort of the AUKUS arrangement. As I said earlier, and as Prime Minister Carney expressed even before the election, there's an interest in having Canada participate in Europe's defense buildup, its €800 billion plan. And what potential is there for Canada, EU cooperation on critical minerals in that context? Maybe, Heather, you can answer that, but either Henry or Abigail can also jump in. And maybe I'll ask Henry to reflect on, after that, maybe Canada has been seen as potentially a partner within AUKUS in Pillar 2, but much of the talk there has also revolved around Canada's contribution, in addition to Australia, naturally, critical minerals for that effort. So maybe, Heather, talk to us a little bit about the potential for EU-Canada collaboration.
Yeah, and I'll go quick because I'd love to hear Abigail's perspective too. But obviously, Canada has been looking to diversify its trade as a result of the threat of tariffs that we've seen from the United States. And obviously, Europe, is an obvious partner, culturally, economically, all those things. And as you mentioned, they are investing quite a bit of state money into infrastructure funds, into defense funds. Not only the EU rearm, but also Germany with a $500 billion defense and infrastructure investment. The European Investment Bank has been putting money into this, into raw materials procurement, and Canada is eligible. So the sharks are circling, working for ways. But I have to say, I had the opportunity to go to the EU Raw Materials Forum in Brussels in December, and it was very eye-opening. Of course, we want them to be partners, but Brussels and Europe is makes Canada look like a breeze to do permitting and to open up mines, and it's not even to mine there as being the trouble, but to sell into the market also comes with quite a few restrictions, quite a bit of paperwork, quite a bit of red tape. And so we all have to work faster and better to be able to trade with each other. My impression after that was that, for a major like BHP or Rio or Teck or Vale, they probably had the capacity to, enter into the European market and expand. But if you're a junior, if you're a small producer, it might take too much of your capacity on the administrative side, on the financial side, to do what you need to do to move into the European market, and that has to change.
Abigail, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just quickly jotted down three quick thoughts of areas for collaboration. So the first is Canada displaced China in the Bloomberg NEF study on lithium-ion battery supply chains as a destination. And the real differentiating factor here was the ESG credentials that Heather pointed to earlier, just the abundance of hydroelectricity in particular has positioned the country really well for multiple off-takers. But given Brussels and multiple member states' priorities around clean energy, it's kind of creating this natural partnership and preference towards these supply chains that have been able to maintain competitiveness because of the industrial rates that many provinces grant different projects, but then also that clean source of inputs. So that's number one. Number two is expertise. There's certainly experts across Europe focused on these issues, but from a policy perspective, I've heard both from the Australian and the Canadian government that they've been working really closely with Brussels as kind of the latest of the Brussels effects takes forms with the Critical Raw Materials Act, with due diligence requirements, the Global Battery Passport, that they're infusing the right level of understanding of what this sector demands in terms of, the policy development. And so that's an area where I hope to see continued engagement transatlantically. And then the last is, there's a multitude of Canadian juniors operating internationally. Brussels has been reaching out to a lot of third-party markets, particularly on the African continent, trying to develop increased projects, work with them on value addition. And a lot of the owners of those projects are headquartered, in Toronto, Vancouver. And so I think that that's a really great opportunity for additional support in those markets, with the benefit to Europeans being alternative and diverse sources of supply coming online.
Thanks. And Henry, do you have some thoughts on maybe AUKUS and how that, how Canada could supply the U.S., Australia, the U.K. For the construction, particularly submarines, but other things that are also contemplated under the agreement?
Absolutely. And now I will also note that we have written a piece together with our affiliate Vincent Rigby about the importance of Canada joining AUKUS. At
least the second pillar.
At least the second pillar. Well, right. We initially talk about how, of course, wouldn't it be lovely if Canada could be part of the first pillar and get nuclear-powered subs would help, ameliorate some of its naval challenges. Much as I think we all stand by that argument that it would be lovely and great.
Particularly for the Arctic.
Particularly for the Arctic. I think that dwelling on that, maybe we don't want to dwell on that for too much longer. Where Canada would be really well poised to contribute is in that second pillar, which talks about certain critical and emerging technologies. So hypersonics, counter-hypersonics, artificial intelligence, advanced sensing and radars, all of these things which do require, which not only can Canada contribute with its vast sort of technical and human capital, but can contribute on the resource side of things. And I would again highlight particularly things like tungsten and niobium, where Canada has actually a comparative advantage compared to even a mineral powerhouse like Australia. And I'll close out by saying as well that this is all in the context of broader U.S., but maybe regional dissatisfaction in Canada's defense spending. This has been a common thread that we've heard for a long time, that Canada is dragging its feet on defense spending, and has certainly come to the fore with the second Trump administration. And I think that while Canada certainly does need to step up its conventional defense spending, another area or another reason why I think the report was well timed is because we identify how mineral security can be something where Canada can very rapidly say, look, we're spending more on our national security because we're investing in mineral security, and that has all these complementarities for stuff like the defense industrial base, for stuff like AUKUS, getting the minerals to being the arsenal of democracy, being, kind of catalyzing European rearmament, American rearmament, Australia, US-UK collaboration. Getting it on that ground floor can be an area where Canada can really, I think, make some big plays in a short amount of time.
And thanks for that. And just before concluding, I think it's important for our audience to know that both Heather and Abigail were thought leaders, and we picked their brains, so to speak, as we were doing the research for the report, which I would invite our listeners and our viewers to read. It's available, Mining for Defense, available on the CSIS website. And with that, we're concluding the event, and I'd like to thank our fantastic panelists, Heather, Abigail, and Henry, for their time and expertise, and look forward to having other events with them in the future. Thank you.